Hi guys, welcome to the first day of our biochemistry unit. This is some real nitty-gritty, hardcore science because biochemistry is not only required information for such varied and awesome fields as engineering, neuroscience, chemical weaponry development, biotech invention, oceanography, and nutrition, but it is also the basis for a fundamental understanding of how our bodies work and how to care for them. We all have bodies, and in this unit, we will learn how to be better body havers. So, biochemistry is largely based on the periodic table. It's based on elements and how they interact and how they form larger molecules. But we're going to start at the basic level. We're going to start with elements and work our way up from there. So I want you to pick out on this table 2 elements that you can name. Now I'm going to give you an example and then you won't be able to use that example as one of your 2. So I'm going to do hydrogen. So if I was going to tell you that I knew that this was hydrogen, I would type H equals hydrogen. So that's what you should type if you want to tell me that you know what one of these is. So again, don't do hydrogen because I just did that one. We need to pick any other molecule off this table and tell me what it is. Did you get 2? So there's a bunch of different ones here, so I'm not going to go through them all. There's a bunch of different molecules here and a bunch of different abbreviations. We're only going to be talking about a couple today because, as it turns out, you don't need that many molecules to do biochemistry. In true chemistry, which you're going to do in a couple years for most of you, you have to use all of these. In biochemistry, you only have to use a few. And we're going to see why today. So first of all, let's start with a definition. As a reminder, you're going to want to be taking notes throughout this section so that you can use those notes later. Using the notes in order to answer the questions is really helpful, and then having them as a reference point for other activities in the future is also a really good idea. So make sure to be taking notes as you go. So the first thing you'll need is a definition of biochemistry. So while the chemistry of life is basically water chemistry, the chemistry of biological molecules is based on carbon. So we're talking a lot about water, and we're also talking a lot about carbon. Carbon, it turns out, is the basis for all life forms. Now we are going to be talking about the water element of it. We're going to be talking about that a little bit tomorrow, because as you might have heard, about 70% of the body is made of water. The parts that aren't are usually made of carbon or carbon-based compounds. It has been said that we're a carbon-based life form. You might hear that in alien movies where they talk about life forms that have different bases, like a silicone-based life form, for example. Everything on Earth, every single living thing is based on one element, and that element is carbon. So our cells are mainly made of carbon, and that's true of not just our cells, but of every living thing on Earth. So why is carbon so special? Well, carbon is special because if you look here, you'll be able to see that this little 6 right here, that refers to the number of electrons. Well, it refers to the number of protons, I should say, but the protons and electrons usually balance each other out. So that refers to the number of protons and electrons in the carbon molecule. And that is actually what makes carbon so unique and so important. You're going to have to reach way back into middle school for some of this, but I'm going to go through it step by step. So all life on Earth is carbon-based. What does carbon look like? Okay, let's take a moment and dissect this diagram. We've got a bunch of protons in the middle. We've got a bunch of neutrons also in the middle. Who remembers, what do we call this collection of protons and neutrons in the middle of an atom? That's right, that's the nucleus. So the nucleus is right there in the middle. And then you have these orbits, and that's where the electrons go. The electrons just move in these orbits, and they basically stay in their lane. They're not messing around. You can imagine them. It's helpful to picture them just kind of staying in their lane and orbiting around, kind of like planets orbit around the sun. That's a good way to start out to picture them. So in the first orbit, you've got 2 electrons, and that's true of every atom. The outer shell, that's going to be the most important place. That's where you really want to look. And we call that outer shell valence. Again, the outer shell is called valence shell and valence electrons. That just means the outside. The reason that chemists and biochemists are so interested in the outside of an electron or the outside of an atom is because that's where the bonding happens. That's where one atom can come up and meet another atom and they can bond. So this is the important shell right here. That outside shell, that's the most important shell. How many electrons does carbon have in its outer shell? Take a moment and count. So carbon has 4. And because carbon has 4 electrons in its valence shell, it's able to do some really incredible things. Because of the way carbon's electrons are formed, it's super versatile. Versatile means you can do a bunch of different things, and it can bond in many, many, many different ways. It can make up a whole bunch of different shapes. And that's really important because if everything's made of carbon, you want something that can do a bunch of different stuff because life on Earth is really varied and really versatile. There's a lot of stuff going on Earth. There's a lot of different things. There's trees and frogs and plants and humans, and we all have different needs. So having carbon be really versatile is super important. As it turns out, because of carbon's shape, it can do a bunch of covalent bonds. When you see this word covalent, you can think of like cooperation means you're doing something together. Covalent means you're sharing something together. So that beginning part that says co, that means like think of cooperation. So it's doing stuff together. So covalent is sharing things together. So when 2 carbon atoms bond, they can share their electrons. One important thing to note, I'm going to go back here for a moment. In this outer shell right here, carbon wants 8. And that's going to be true of every single element that we look at today. 8 is the magic number. That's what all of these different elements want. In their outer shell, they want 8 different electrons. In order to be really balanced and really happy and really satisfied, in order to have a full life, they want 8 electrons. So, with that in mind, in order to get its 8, carbon can share electrons with other carbons. And if they're sharing enough electrons, they're pretty happy. So they can form covalent bonds. Covalent bonds happen, again, when molecules share electrons. So take a moment and look at these carbon molecules. What do you notice about how many bonds each carbon has? Well, you might have noticed each carbon has 4 bonds, and I'll show you. So each of these lines represents 1 bond. So this right here, attached to this middle carbon, this is 1 bond. Over here, attached to the same carbon, this is a 2nd bond. Down here, attached to the same carbon, this is a 3rd bond. And then right here is a 4th bond. So this carbon, this one right there, has 4 bonds. Well, is that true of every carbon? Let's look. The one right next to it, sure enough, it's got 1 bond, 2 bonds, 3 bonds, and 4 bonds. How about over here? This carbon on the left has 1 bond going like that, another bond going like that, 1 bond in the middle, and then a double bond. So this one's got 2 over here. So sure enough, that one has 4. Same on this side. Here we've got a triple bond, so that's 3. This carbon has 3 on this side and 1 over here. So carbon can bond in a bunch of different ways. Each carbon has to have 4 bonds in order to be filled, and it can do that with single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds. Any of these ways is totally fine for a carbon molecule in order to get its required 4 bonds in order to be happy and content. It can be 4 single bonds, 2 single bonds and a double bond, 2 double bonds, 1 triple bond, and 1 single bond. It can do any of those combinations in order to get its requirement. So with that in mind, fix the following carbon bonds. What you're going to do is for each of these, you're just going to type in the C and then the dashes and any H's that you want to add in. And that's my hint, is you may want to add in some extra hydrogens in order to complete these. There are a lot of different correct options here, and I'm going to show you a couple. But first I want you to try it for yourself. Fix the following carbon bonds. Did you get them? Okay, so there's a couple ways to do this. You could give a double bond there, and then put an H over here, and an H over there, and that would be fine. And you'd have to do the same on this side, an H over there, and an H over there. And then this one would be complete. So you could have a double bond and then 2 single bonds with H's on the end of each one, and that would be fine. You could also do, and that would actually look a lot like this ethene. That's number 1. For number 2, you could just put H's right here, and that would be fine, and that would create a nice molecule with 4 single bonds, and we've seen that as well. Oops, maybe we didn't, but imagine that right here, instead of a C, it's just an H, and that would be fine. So that would be number 2 right there. This one's a little trickier. You've got a double bond, you've got another double bond, and then you've got a single bond. So I'm going to start here. This C, this carbon, already has 3 bonds. So all it needs is 1 more bond. Now you could create a triple bond. That would be fine. You could also add an H. That would be fine too. So if I created a triple bond, then I'd want to create another triple bond, and then I'd want to add an H on the end. And that would be a way to fix number 3. So there's a lot of good options here, and I'll be giving you feedback about those. So there's some other important elements to remember. Every macromolecule in your body is made up of really 4 different elements. 4, that's all you need for biochemistry. It's not nearly as complicated as chemistry is, because you only are looking at 4 elements. You're looking at hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon. A warning. If you have not been taking notes up to this point, now is the time to start. I'm going to be giving you how many bonds each of these need, and if you don't have that information in front of you, it's going to be almost impossible to do the activities for the rest of the week. You're going to really need to know what types of bonds each of these can make, and how many bonds each needs. You already know carbon. Carbon needs 4 bonds in order to be happy. I'm going to tell you how many bonds the rest needs, and you'll need to write it down. You'll need that as a reference point in order to solve some of these puzzles. So it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle, right? You have the number that it needs, and then you can fit them together in a bunch of different ways. Okay, so hydrogen only has 1 electron, so it can only make 1 bond. Now you might be saying, wait, Ms. Torelli, that doesn't make any sense. I thought this needed 8. Well, that's true in the second circle. However, hydrogen only has 1 electron, so it didn't even fill up the first circle. Its valence orbit is its only orbit. So hydrogen is actually pretty weak. It's a very small, very weak element, and it often, in fact, basically the only way it can bond is to have its electron stolen. Is to have its electron taken, more or less. So hydrogen kind of gets picked on. It is not strong enough to pull 7 different or even 1 other electron from another element. It's just not strong enough. It's not going to be able to do that. So all it really does is it gets its electron taken. You don't have to remember the reason why. What you do have to remember is that hydrogen can only bond once. That's all hydrogen can do. So again, you want to have down that hydrogen can bond once. Nitrogen has 5 electrons. So how many would it need in order to get, so in its outer circle, in its valence circle, it's got 5 electrons. How many would it need to get complete, to be happy? Well, you know it needs 8 altogether, so that means it can bond 3 times. So nitrogen can make 3 covalent bonds. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, so that means it needs 2 more electrons to be complete. So it can make 2 bonds. And that's it. That's all you need. So oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell. Nitrogen has 5 electrons in its outer shell. Hydrogen has 1 electron in its outer shell. And we know carbon already has 4. So hydrogen can make 1 bond. Nitrogen can make 3 bonds. And oxygen can make 2 bonds. We're going to play around with these concepts a little bit, so that you guys can get a good idea of like how exactly these molecules fit together. You'll get to do some trial and error in order to figure it out, and we're going to jump into that in just a moment. Thanks for watching, guys.